Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by His Excellency Wilton D. Gregory, Archbishop of Washington. A former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Archbishop Gregory has been a leader of Catholic Jewish and Black Jewish relations for decades and served as Archbishop of Atlanta for 14 years. Many of you may recognize Archbishop Gregory from his appearance on the AJC Global Forum stage in 2019, when he joined over a dozen religious and community leaders to unveil the AJC Community of Conscience, aimed at rejecting bigotry and amplifying values that unite all Americans. Today's discussion on race in America, the faith perspective, will be moderated by AJC Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations, Rabbi Noam Marans. After we hear from Noam and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That is questions plural. Rabbi Marans, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. Archbishop, let me begin by expressing our gratitude for your decades-long commitment to Black Jewish and Catholic Jewish relations, for your relationship steadfast with the Jewish community in general and AJC in particular, with our interreligious affairs team, with Rabbi David Rosen and me and others, and most especially to AJC Atlanta, led by our good friend Dov Wilker, where you served for 14 years. And now, in just a short period of time, 14 months, you have developed a relationship with AJC Atlanta, led by Alan Ronkin, and as was indicated, participated very early in your tenure in our Community of Conscience kickoff in Washington last year. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you.
So Archbishop, we are in the fourth month of a very challenging time for America. Unprecedented series of national crises. A pandemic that has already taken the lives of over 130,000 Americans, leading to a peak unemployment of over 14%, vast economic insecurity. And then that was followed by a month of mostly peaceful protests, although some violence, by Americans of all colors against racial injustice and the policing that led to the death of George Floyd and many other unarmed African Americans over many years. What is happening to America? What is this moment about? How does a national religious leader, a Catholic archbishop, an African American leader, reflect upon and respond to these unprecedented times?
Rabbi, these times fill my heart both with deep sorrow at the sufferings of people in light of the pandemic, in light of the economic repercussions, and also in light of the obviously cruel and unjust murder of innocent people. But it also fills my heart with a with a hope, because as we have seen, many of the protests, if not most of the protests, have been a wonderful assembly of Americans across cultural, racial, age, regional, religious affiliations. So there's a certain hope that maybe we have reached a plateau where we can together address some of the things that have been the flashpoints, some of the events that have caused us such national anxiety and angst. This is different, I think, I feel, I hope, than the mere civil rights era that produced some legislative initiatives that accomplished some important moments in our nation's history, because I think this moment also offers us the possibility of changing hearts, not just changing laws, not just changing structures, but changing hearts. And I think ultimately that's the cause, the reason that we may be at a different moment in time. And it's wedded, obviously, Rabbi, it's wedded to the sorrow that has led us to this moment, not just the assassination, the suffocation of George Floyd, but all of those victims of hatred within the African-American community. But I also must acknowledge, as you well know, within the Jewish community too, the terrible events that took place in synagogues, in too many synagogues, assassinating, killing innocent Jewish worshipers. All of it coalesces, Rabbi, and hopefully it has touched and is touching the hearts of people throughout our country and indeed across the globe.
Thank you for that. And I think we all have sensed that this is a different moment in our lifetimes, and that there are people of goodwill who are coming together. But many people are worried that after the first flash of coalition and marching, that we won't be able to necessarily stay the course for change. What are the 1, 2, or 3 things that we need to be able to get out of this that will make people feel that their energy, their protests, their taking to the streets is going to make a difference? Has some of that already happened? And what yet will need to happen?
Well, first of all, I think some of it has begun to happen because in addition to the protesters and the media coverage of these events, there's another investment that has occurred that hadn't taken place at this level in prior moments. For example, the American business community is now responding. The American sporting community is now responding. The media is covering this in a level of intensity that I don't recall before. Now, obviously, we're in a different moment because of social communications than we were, say, in 1963, when the civil rights movement was really in an intense moment. But we have seen, at least I think we've seen, a steady and prolonged involvement of a corporate nature that was not present before. And I think that, for me, when we as a nation start to talk about those heavyweight realities that so influence our nation, it bespeaks a different moment. I hope, I pray.
Thank you. Let's pivot for a moment, shall we call it, to American civics. We're trained from our earliest day regarding the mantra of separation of church and state, and we have navigated that over centuries, and it's part of the American culture. But there's also the topic of religion and politics. They have not been as easily separated in our history. In fact, they are as entangled today as they have ever been. So you are a religious leader. You're the Archbishop of Washington in the maelstrom of politics. What's the proper role of religion and politics? What is the proper role of religion in politics?
Well, when we refer to the separation of church and state, I think we are reflecting on the separation of powers and also the anti-establishment clause of the Constitution, that there is no religion that will be established as a national religion. But I think the role of religious communities, whether they be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or the other many religious communities that are present, is to provide a moral voice based on the highest principles of our religious traditions that challenges, that encourages, that is used as a standard of justice that will help our nation wind its way through the labyrinth of social challenges that we face. We don't have a national religion, and that's a good thing, because I think it frees all of the religious communities to speak boldly and prophetically on issues that that touch the nation's conscience, that should influence the way that we treat one another, that we conduct business, that we identify as a nation of many different cultures and backgrounds and religions, languages now. I think that's an important component of the faith traditions of the wide variety of religions that call the United States their home now.
You have described, Archbishop, I think knowingly, that this was the role of the prophets in the biblical Israel period, in the Hebrew Bible, and of course in the Christian scriptures in a different way, in which they spoke truth to power, and they represented morality and check on royal abuse.
Yes, and that's why I think it's important that our religious institutions are not co-opted and lose that platform of spiritual prophecy.
Let's turn a little bit to Black-Jewish relations. You have an interesting personal story. You grew up in the South Side of Chicago. You served as a priest in that archdiocese, and then as the bishop in Belleville in southern Illinois, and then a long stint in Atlanta, where there are wonderfully vibrant Black and Jewish communities, and now in Washington. And throughout, you've always been a key player in Black-Jewish relations. The Jewish people, of course, are very proud of the role they have played in relationship with African Americans, and particularly in the civil rights movement, but not only, ongoing. And we sometimes like to hold up that iconic photograph of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marching hand in hand with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who ultimately spoke at his funeral. He was a close friend, his closest Jewish partner in the prophecy realm, so to speak. But that photograph was perhaps not as complex as the relationship between Blacks and Jews have always been. So say a word about that relationship in the past, in the present, in the future, and even on a personal level for you, if you don't mind.
One of the stories or one of the experiences that I hold dear is soon after I arrived in Atlanta, within a couple of months, I received a very kind invitation from a number of Jewish leaders and business people and rabbis who wanted to welcome me. And we had a brunch meeting, I believe, and they, a group of maybe 30, 40 people all said how pleased and happy they were that I was the new Archbishop. But then they gave me a lesson in Atlanta history that I had not known so directly. They said, in Atlanta, the African American community and the Jewish community were joined at the hip because we had both experienced the bigotry that was unfortunately a part of the legacy there. So they wanted me to know that we had an awful lot in common because we were both minority communities, the Catholic Church certainly, but we had both suffered from the extreme hatred that up until quite recently sometimes was glossed over. Events were enacted that were never really cared for under law. I can remember for the 50th anniversary of the terrible bombing of the temple in Atlanta that I sent a floral homage to Rabbi Peter Berg, the senior rabbi at the temple, telling him that, the Catholic community, the Black community, recalled with great sorrow the sufferings of our Jewish brothers and sisters, not only in that event, but in so many other less public expressions of hatred. So that welcoming luncheon or a brunch in Atlanta forged a wonderful friendship that I still treasure to this day with the Atlanta Jewish community.
So can I drill down a bit? What would you identify as the successes over the decades, and what are the challenges that remain in Black-Jewish relations today?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that we need to recognize that that we have both groups, the African American group and the Jewish group, need to recognize that we have been victims of hatred. But to turn that coin, are also survivors. We are triumphant in our resilience to respond to that and not to return hatred for hatred. That's a very important piece that we have to take into our future, both as religious people, because our traditions, whether we are Christian or Jewish, our traditions call us to forgiveness, call us to recognize that hatred can never be the last word that is spoken in any dialogue or event.
We at AJC have decided very clearly that it's not enough to just speak. It's also very important to act. We began it in recent times with the community of conscience, but that was just another milestone in a long history. But that was a key kickoff during this new era. At that same global forum last year in Washington, we showcased the newly rejuvenated Black Jewish Caucus that brings together African American and Jewish legislators. And in the wake of the recent challenges and the deaths of African Americans at the hands of the police, unarmed African Americans, we've inaugurated a plan of action to address these issues, whether it be policing or advocating for the No Hate Act, which would guarantee more reporting of hate crimes. I know you know this, but I share with our listening audience that African Americans occupy the greatest percentage of victimization of hate crimes, and Jews represent the highest percentage of victimization of hate crimes directed at a faith group.
Yes.
We've opened up 2 new offices as a result of recent events, one in the Twin Cities and one in Louisville because of the murders of African Americans there and those uprisings. So we're trying to translate our speech into action. We have to make sure that we capture this moment.
You know, Rabbi, one of the things that I am happy to say that I can build on as the Archbishop of Washington, as an African American, is the recent letter that the U.S. bishops authored not terribly long ago, an Open Wide Your Hearts response to racism. And that too calls for actions that bring together our people in listening sessions and in advocacy programs. Because as I said at the beginning of our conversation, what seems to me to be different, or what will have the most lasting effect, is the changing of hearts, the realization that racism and hatred and bigotry are not just issues outside of my own life, outside of my own skin, my own flesh, but I have to ask myself, what part of this do I play? What is there within me that needs conversion, that needs honest evaluation and a commitment to do better? Both of our religious traditions have penitential seasons that are critical to our religious year, and we can't gloss over those. And I hope that the events that have so rocked and continue to rock our nation will play some role in those penitential seasons in the future, that we bring with us as we enter those seasons of reconciliation and conversion, a memory that says we need to do this both corporately as well as personally.
Speaking of reconciliation and conversion, these are apt metaphors to describe the transformation in Catholicism and in Christianity in its relationship to Jews and Judaism. And we spoke a moment ago about Rabbi Heschel, and he gets a starring role in this part of our conversation as well. As you well know, my legendary predecessor, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, in the 1960s, brought Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel as teacher into the AJC orbit, and then introduced him to Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was the key player in the lead up over many years to the future document Nostra Aetate, In Our Time, which was promulgated in 1965 and did quite a few things. It rejected the assertion of collective responsibility of the Jewish people then and now in the death of Jesus. It rejected the teaching of contempt. It began to affirm the eternity of the covenant of the Jewish people with God. It was the beginning of a new era that you and I and many others before us have worked so hard to achieve. And you, Archbishop, in the United States and internationally, have filled all of the major roles that one can in the Catholic-Jewish dialogue that enabled us to segue from a history of anti-Judaism that built the foundation for the Holocaust and took us into a new era, even a golden era of Catholic-Jewish relations through the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops as its president, as its moderator of Jewish affairs, as the bishop who led the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious. The list goes on, and now again, you're back as the Catholic chair of the dialogue between the Bishops' Conference and the National Council of Synagogues. Tell us, in your words, how all of this happened. How did we do it? How far did we come, and where do we yet need to go?
I think, Rabbi, as you mentioned the blessed name of Rabbi Heschel, I'd like to add two other names to that list. One is John Paul II, because probably of all of the modern popes, he brought his personal experience of living through the Second World War and witnessing the effects of the Holocaust on some of his own Jewish friends, kids that he grew up with, and he never forgot that. And he, once he was elected to the papacy, he kept reminding Catholics that our Jewish brothers and sisters were our oldest brothers and sisters. And he spoke from personal experience of what religious hatred can do in the life of a young man who witnesses the awful treatment of neighbors and other young people that he had grown up with. The second name would be Pope Francis, who, while he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, developed a wonderful relationship with the Jewish community in Argentina. And so these two men brought their own experience into the papal office and reminded us, and continue to remind us, of the importance of setting aside anything that has any vestige of anti-Semitism attached to it. We've got work to do, Rabbi, as you know. We're not yet standing on the winner's platform, but we can see it from here.
Sometimes we think about what those challenges are, and I'm going to poke you on that in a moment. but I'd like to compliment what you said in both ways, compliment with an E and with an I. It really was the visuals of the three popes, first John Paul II, then Benedict XVI, and then Francis, who now make it a tradition of what a pope does in order to bring to life Nostra Aetate, diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, state visit to the State of Israel, visiting Holocaust sites and there on speaking of forgiveness and responsibility, visiting synagogues, as John Paul II and others would like to say, the first pope to visit a synagogue since Peter. But also, we have a shift in the geography of Catholicism today, don't we? Where
yes.
Catholics are living and growing in places where there are fewer Jews. How do we address that? And here in the United States, we have priests who are coming from places where they're not familiar with Jews and Judaism, and surely not Nostra Aetate. I'm sure you have experience with that.
I certainly do. I'm very proud of the fact that I am a member and a leader of a universal church. That is a church that is present in every culture and land throughout the world. But our experiences are not universal in their breadth. And so you very correctly say that we have Catholics, lay, clerical, religious, who come from nations and cultures where the Jewish community is very small, if present at all in any great numbers. And so it is up to us, those of us who are members of the church where we do have lots of Jewish brothers and sisters, and where we have a history of not always living the religious principles that belong to our church in reference to our Jewish neighbors and friends, we have to bring that along with us and remind those who may not know that the result of anti-Semitism is destructive not just to society, but it is a contradiction of our religious faith. As John Paul II would constantly remind us, our eldest brothers and sisters are the Jewish community. And we cannot replicate the awful events that are captured in the book of Genesis, where Cain and Abel, two brothers, are caught in an awful conflict. We have to remind people of that. And in addition, we have to realize that the world in which we live is a world filled with people of many different religious traditions. Some of the great religions of the East, Islam, some of the religious traditions that belong to the Pacific, Pacific Rim. Those are religions that, while they are different, they have a dignity that we must acknowledge and respect, lest we turn our energies away from anti-Semitism and engage in other horrible acts of bigotry and hatred.
Thank you, Archbishop, and I'm ready to share your wealth of wisdom, Archbishop, with our listening audience, and I'm going to ask Daniel if he's ready to begin sharing some of the questions that he undoubtedly has received from the hundreds who are listening in. Daniel, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Marans, and thank you, Archbishop. Our first question comes through Zoom from Philip Cunningham. Many observers have noted the remarkable rapprochement between Catholics and Jews that has occurred in the last 50 years since the Second Vatican Council issued the Declaration Nostra Aetate. Their journey of friendship, as Pope Francis has called it, is unprecedented in history, and both communities had to learn and to unlearn much about each other. What lessons about Jews do you think Catholics had to learn or unlearn in order to develop mutually enriching dialogue? And can the experience of Catholic-Jewish rapprochement inform the challenges facing the U.S. today?
As Daniel, one part of my background is that I have professional training in Catholic worship liturgy. And I think a rich source of our understanding of our Jewish community, neighbors, friends, brothers, and sisters, is how much our worship is directly related to the Jewish community. The models of prayer, our sacramental signs, the understanding of coming together in common worship are directly related to Jewish liturgical customs. Our prayer, the Eucharistic prayer in Catholic theology, is patterned after the Jewish barakah. So, there's so much that we as Catholics need to know about that ritual tradition that is a direct link to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And the more we know about that, I think the better we can both appreciate our own liturgical traditions, but also honor that linkage that we have with the Jewish community.
Archbishop and Daniel, I believe that question was from Philip Cunningham, who is a professor of Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Joseph's University, a key player in Catholic Jewish relations and a good friend of AJC. I turn it back to you, Daniel, for the next question.
Thank you, Rabbi. Our next question comes from Bob Drake in Long Island. Archbishop, thank you for that thought-provoking presentation and for all of your work. I've been involved in interfaith relations for decades, and the Catholic-Jewish story inspires me. When I try to talk to my teenage and college-age grandchildren about it, their eyes glaze over. How do we get young Catholics and young Jews to care about this work more and take up the mantle for the next generation?
Daniel, thank you for that question. I can recall in one of the sessions that I was privileged to share when I was the co-chair of the Jewish Catholic Dialogue before, the issue of young people and their religious development and heritage is a joint problem. I can recall sitting around the table with the other dialogue participants, some of whom were rabbis, some of whom were professors, most of whom were married people with kids and young adults in their own lives. And we all acknowledged the great difficulty that we have in sharing our own religious traditions with our young people. Whether we are Jewish or Catholics, there is a huge mountain that we have to climb to make sure that our young people know their religious heritage. Now, let's face it, young people go through many, many different stages of development. When they first go off to college, and many of them decide that first experience of freedom frees them from everything, frees them from the wisdom and the guidance of parents, frees them from their religious heritage, and so that's a big challenge. But I think this moment is also a hopeful time, because we see so many of our young adults engaged in the protests against racism and hatred. It might be a kairos moment for us to say, what we are protesting is the rejection of our religious principles of human respect, dignity, the call to live a common life in a nation that is comprised of people of many different backgrounds and religious traditions. So there's a hopeful moment that if we, as Catholics, as Jews, as Americans, can seize on the openness, the interest that many of our young people have in this moment, that we can say, yes, this is part of our legacy. Hatred is not.
And we have the ability to mobilize the social justice traditions of our churches, synagogues, and mosques. It's not an accident that the historically Black Protestant churches are so engaged in social justice, and we see that they and other churches are playing a critical role at this moment, hearkening back to what we saw during the civil rights time. Daniel, we're ready for another question.
Our next question comes from Celine Foley in Detroit, Michigan. I have read that there are multiple Christian denominations that have become self-reflective about Christian, or at least denominational, complicity over the centuries in the sin of racism. Is this a fair portrayal of Christianity? If so, what can and should be done about this past and corrected for the future?
Well, I think it is a moment, Daniel, where we are reflecting, hopefully, with a certain spiritual depth, and acknowledging that part of the legacy of racism has been justified, certainly by Christian either misuse of Scripture, but also out of disinterest. Pope Francis has often said, and I think with great insight, it's not just that people are engaged in horrible acts of violence, hatred, racism, terror, but that too many are disinterested. And it is that lack of interest that I hope is a part of our spiritual reflection that gives some direction to the outcome of the moment in which we are engaged.
And no religious tradition, not mine, not yours, has been exempt from these awful moments, passages, texts, reflections that needed to evolve and become a better part of who we want to be, to affirm the divine image that God has implanted in each of us, Archbishop.
Yes. Yes. We need to rediscover our roots.
Yes, we absolutely have more time for a few more questions. So our next question comes from Isaiah Thompson in New York. I recently joined the board of a Jewish organization where I'm the first Jew of color to serve as a board member. You are clearly in a position of power and influence in the church. Do you feel a special responsibility to represent the interests of Black Catholics in that role? How do you do it while thinking about all of your constituents? And do you have any message or advice for Jews of color who are trying to make our voices heard in a world that hasn't paid enough attention to us?
Well, yes, I do have a special responsibility, obviously, as a member of the African-American community. Just to look at the Archbishop is to say, he's an African-American. What does he think? How is he feeling about this issue? But as the Archbishop of Washington, I'm not just the Archbishop of African-American Catholics. I'm the Archbishop of all Catholics, every age and cultural tradition and language group. So it's a dual responsibility, and one that I welcome. I'm not sorry that the Lord has asked me to be in this position at this particular time. And I only ask his prayer, the prayers of people and the Lord's grace, that I balance those two responsibilities well, that I don't neglect one at the cost of the other. It's part of my job.
Archbishop, I don't know if you had regularly told this story, but it deeply moved me, and I would ask you to share with our audience what you said, I believe at Georgetown, about your experience processing the lynching of Emmett Till.
Well, Rabbi, I was very young, I think maybe 7 or 8 years old, when Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi. And his mother, he was a young man who lived in Chicago. He had gone to Mississippi over the summer, which was not an uncommon practice among young African-American kids in Chicago whose family, grandparents, aunts, uncles were in the South. They would go south for the summer to visit relatives and friends. So it's not uncommon. When he was killed, his body was returned to Chicago for the funeral rites. His mother insisted that the casket be open so that people could see the awful events that had taken the life of her son. And I was taken to that wake. Actually, it was, I read about it now, but I don't remember it because most kids at 7 or 8 years old don't have that kind of consciousness yet to see all of the ramifications. But my grandmother wanted me to go to visit with the family at this wake. And it was part of the talk that a lot of many, if not most, young Black men receive, how to respond to, attacks, obviously not as graphic and as brutal as that, but how to conduct yourself in the face of a hostile environment. And I never forgot that. I never forgot that.
So even as we are celebrating progress, Archbishop, there are some things that have not progressed enough and they are repeating themselves, even if they are not as brutal as the Emmett Till matter. They are parallel incidents that we are still experiencing, are we not?
Yes. And, Rabbi, you and I remember going to France, Paris, a number of years ago as part of the Ichkick journey of dialogue. And one of the things that I remember in that trip was visiting a number of Jewish communities where young Jewish people had to be cautioned, young Jewish boys had to be cautioned about wearing the yarmulke in an environment where they could be harmed. So, the challenges of living in a violent and racially oppressive condition is still with us. We have to train ourselves both to be brave, but also to be prudent.
We did not know that we may perhaps should have known, but we did not know 20 years ago that we were at the cusp of a horrific spike in anti-Semitism, a deadly spike in anti-Semitism, first in Europe, and now, alas, in our beloved United States, as you indicated earlier, the incidents at synagogues where people were brutally murdered during prayer, but not only that, arise in all kinds of forms of anti-Semitism that has paralleled a rise in racism and teaches us that although these are separate phenomena, they are parallel phenomena because haters are equal opportunity haters.
Yes.
People who hate all others. They don't limit themselves.
You know, Rabbi, I have always believed, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I find my involvement with Jewish Catholic dialogue so life-giving, is that the ignorance of the other is the soil in which hatred and bigotry grows. So as long as we don't know about one another, as long as we don't share our history, share our dreams, share our fears, share our hopes, we make it possible for people to engage in acts of violence and hatred. Two things that I am very proud to claim as part of my Atlanta heritage. I was there during the 40th anniversary of the issuance of Nostra Aetate. And with the Jewish community, we decided to have a commemorative event together. And it would be based on our sacred music. We would turn to things that we are very proud of in our heritage, and we would share it with each other. And I can remember one of the organizing Jewish leaders said, well, let's host this at Christ the King Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral. And I said, no, let's host it at the temple, because my bet is more Jewish people have been in a Catholic church than Catholics have been in a synagogue. So we held it at the temple. It was magnificent. And it was something that we could all be proud of. It's events like that. Granted, they are not, the be all and end all, but they help us understand one another better. They allow us to share part of our history, part of our heritage, part of our traditions, things that make us Jews and Catholics. And we want each other to know about them and to respect and honor them.
Thank you, Archbishop. Daniel, I turn it back to you since you're watching the clock.
Sure. We have time for one final question, and I think this question from Michaela LeBlanc from the Knights of Peter Claver and Ladies Auxiliary in Los Angeles, California is a great way to conclude. So she says, Rabbi Marans and Archbishop Gregory, thank you for this dialogue and education for many on the shared history of our faiths and cultures in this world. What suggestions do you both have to move forward in action in addition to this dialogue so that we can make this moment in our lifetime a norm for the future?
Archbishop?
One of the things that I would suggest is that this kind of dialogue, we can do it, we can Zoom it, and it's across the country, probably across the globe. But I would think it would be very important on the local level for Catholic communities, dioceses, rabbinical organizations, Jewish associations on the local level to find an opportunity to come together beyond this moment. And please God, we will move beyond this moment with the progress that we can make. But to find an opportunity to be together, whatever it might be, however small it might be, it's a beginning. Plant a tree, have a common Thanksgiving event, find some way on the local level to bring Catholics and Jews, Catholics, Black Catholics, Jewish people of all different cultural and ethnic traditions, to bring them together. Hatred cannot grow where there is personal respect, knowledge, and involvement.
And I would only add that my happiest moments were often when I was a congregational rabbi and I could be in an intimate kind of relationship with a local priest, and Catholics and Jews would be visiting each other's houses of worship. That's what Archbishop Gregory is talking about. It's such a simple but profound act to reach out to a Catholic if you are a Jew, and to develop a relationship with your neighbor, and vice versa. Catholics and Jews have been blessed in this country and probably have been successful in Catholic-Jewish reconciliation because we have lived in similar neighborhoods. We have lived cheek by jowl in particular neighborhoods, but sometimes we have not reached out across. Maybe we took our child to the Catholic Church for an event of one child, and maybe for the Catholics to a bar mitzvah, but we have to get beyond that and make sure we understand one another as adults in addition to being as children, and that's how we're going to make a difference. Daniel.
Thank you both for that fascinating and timely and important conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so that we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue building closer ties with other faith and ethnic communities and confronting common challenges. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature a conversation with AJC CEO David Harris. For the past 40 years, AJC CEO David Harris, described by the late Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, has been a leading advocate for strengthening Israel's place in the community of nations, for deepening ties with key countries, and for advancing Israel's quest for enduring peace and security. As Israel is once again in the news, David Harris will discuss the tough questions, complex issues, and new opportunities. This program will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, July 1st at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you will join us. Rabbi Marans, Archbishop Gregory, thank you both again for joining us today.
Thank you, Archbishop.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. God bless.
Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.